You have been told this story before. You heard it framed as inspiration, the young genius meeting the old master, two towering minds in the same room, a passing of some invisible torch from one generation to the next, warm, safe, completely useless. That version of the story was designed to make you feel good. It was not designed to give you anything real. The actual story of what happened when Richard Feynman and Albert Einstein shared a room in Princeton, 1940, is something far more uncomfortable and far more powerful. Because what nobody tells you is what Einstein refused to do, and why that refusal exposed a lie that is still being told to you today, in every classroom, every boardroom, and every performance review you will ever sit through. Before you hear what happened in that room, let me say something that your education never said to you directly. You were not slow, you were not incapable, you were not the problem. The system was. It was built deliberately to make intelligent people doubt their own thinking and look upward for permission. If you have spent decades feeling like your ideas needed someone else's stamp before they were real, that feeling was the correct response to an incorrect setup. Keep that in mind as this story unfolds. Because what Einstein did that afternoon was a direct demonstration of exactly why that setup is a lie. Here is the scene as it actually happened. Princeton University, late 1940. A 22-year-old graduate student named Richard Feynman is at the blackboard in a seminar room, writing equations. His hand is shaking. It's not because of the equations. Those he knows cold. The hand is shaking because of what Professor Eugene Wigner told him in the hallway 2 days earlier. Wigner had pulled Feynman aside to tell him about the audience he had assembled for this seminar. Feynman's research with his advisor John Wheeler had been producing something new, a radical reframing of how electrons exchange energy, what would later be called the Wheeler-Feynman absorber theory. Wigner found it interesting enough to build a room around it, so he began to list the names. Henry Norris Russell, Wigner told him. The most famous astronomer of the generation. Feynman went yellow. John von Neumann, the greatest mathematician alive, full stop. Feynman went greener. Wolfgang Pauli, recently arrived from Switzerland. One of the architects of quantum mechanics, Nobel laureate. A man whose intellectual brutality in seminars was so legendary that his critical presence in your audience was known in physics circles as the Pauli effect. Feynman was now, in his own words, completely green. And then Wigner said the last name. Professor Einstein only rarely comes to our weekly seminars, Wigner told him. But your work is so interesting that he has been invited specially, so he is coming too. Feynman wrote about this moment 40 years later. In the 1985 memoir, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, in a chapter he titled, with characteristic bluntness, Monster Minds. That title tells you everything about how that hallway conversation felt from the inside. These were not colleagues. These were not peers. In the mind of a 22-year-old graduate student about to give his first ever seminar, these were something closer to forces of nature with faces. The morning of the talk arrives. Einstein walks in. His first words to Feynman, "Hello, I'm coming to your seminar." Courteous, simple, almost disarming. Then Einstein looks around the room and asks his first actual question of the entire event. "Where is the tea?" Feynman would later write that he was very glad he could answer at least one of Einstein's questions that day. The seminar proceeds. Feynman presents the work. His hand shakes through parts of it. He gets through it. The room follows. And then the seminar ends, and it is time for questions. And here is the moment that schools have been sanitizing out of this story ever since. What happens next changes everything about how you should think about authority, expertise, and your own right to hold an idea in your head without someone else's permission. Before getting there, pause. Because there is something you need to understand about the world you were raised inside. A world so thoroughly constructed around one specific lie that most people cannot even see the walls anymore. You were trained from the first day of school to believe that your ideas have no value until an authority figure confirms them. Think about how deep that conditioning runs. You raise your hand and wait. You submit the paper and wait for the grade. You pitch the idea in the meeting and glance at the senior person in the room to see if they are nodding. You get the degree and put it on the wall and wait for people to treat your opinions as worth hearing. This is not a coincidence. It is a design. The mechanism has a name, authority validation. The invisible rule that says an idea is not real until someone with credentials stamps it as real. Schools built this system deliberately, because students who need a teacher's approval to trust their own thinking are far easier to manage than students who don't. Obedient thinkers stay in their lanes. They complete the assignments. They do not question the syllabus. They grow up into adults who need the approval of a manager, a boss, a panel, a peer reviewer before they will commit to what they already know. You were not born needing this approval. It was installed. And the genius of the system is that it looks like merit. It looks like rigor. It looks like the proper process for evaluating ideas. Maybe because who could argue with the idea that the most qualified people in the room should weigh in on new theories? Nobody argues with it. That is how it survives. Wolfgang Pauli understood this system perfectly. He did not merely operate within it, he weaponized it. And what he did at the end of Feynman's seminar in Princeton, 1940, was not a scientific critique. It was a demonstration of exactly how the authority validation machine operates when it is running at full power. To understand what Einstein destroyed that afternoon, you first have to understand precisely what Pauli was building. The seminar ends. Feynman has finished presenting the Wheeler-Feynman absorber theory, this new way of thinking about the interaction of electrons using half-advanced and half-retarded electromagnetic waves. It is strange work, radical work, the kind of work that either becomes foundational or gets quietly abandoned, and nobody in that room knows yet which direction it will go. Pauli stands up. In his own account, Feynman recalls that Pauli delivered his critique with his characteristic bluntness, listing objection after objection. I do not think this theory can be right, because of dis, and dis, and dis. Every dis is a nail. Every dis is meant to seal the coffin a little tighter. And then Pauli does the thing. The move. The oldest power play in academic physics. He turns to the man sitting next to him, the most famous scientist on Earth, the author of Special and General Relativity, the person whose name had become synonymous with the word genius itself, and says, "Don't you agree, Professor Einstein? Stop here, because this moment is not about physics. It is about something much older and much more human than physics." What Pauli has just done is borrow Einstein's authority to finish what his own arguments could not. He has issued a critique, stacked it on the table, and then reached for the biggest weapon in the room to drive it through. If Einstein nods, if Einstein says, yes, I agree, this theory cannot be right, then the conversation is over. Not because of the logic, because of the name. This is the Pauli move, and you have seen it 1,000 times in your own life, even if nobody ever named it for you. It is the senior colleague who challenges your proposal in a meeting and then immediately turns to the department head. Wouldn't you agree this approach has problems? It is the professor who tears apart a student's argument and then cites 3 authorities to confirm the demolition. It is the job interview panel where one skeptical interviewer defers to the most senior person in the room for a verdict that ends the conversation. The move works because everyone in the room, including you, has been trained to believe it is legitimate. It looks like seeking a second opinion. It is actually the weaponization of hierarchy. Now the room is waiting. Einstein pauses, and then he says, "No." A long German-sounding no, polite, deliberate, almost gentle. And then the most important sentence Einstein spoke that entire afternoon. The sentence nobody taught you in school, the sentence that contains the actual lesson. I find only that it would be very difficult to make a corresponding theory for gravitational interaction. That is all. Not, this theory is wrong. Not, I agree with Professor Pauli's objections. Not the blanket condemnation that every person in that room, including 22-year-old Richard Feynman, was braced to receive. One specific concern, gravity, his own field, the territory where he had something earned to say. Everything else? Silence. In his memoir, Feynman wrote 4 words about Einstein's behavior in that seminar that took him 40 years to find. Those 4 words were this: he was very tolerant of other ideas. Schools want you to read that as a compliment. Or it is not a compliment. It is an observation about a discipline, one of the hardest disciplines in intellectual life, that Feynman recognized because he had watched it operate in real time, under maximum pressure, in the one moment when abandoning it would have been the easiest thing Einstein ever did. Here is the first thing that moment reveals, and it is the thing nobody in your education ever had the courage to name. Pauli's move was a social technology, not a scientific one. The critique itself, the dis and dis and dis, may have been valid. As Feynman himself later noted, the theory was eventually found to be unsatisfactory when extended to quantum mechanics. Pauli was not wrong to have concerns. But the moment Pauli turned to Einstein and asked, "Don't you agree?" The moment he reached for the authority rather than the argument, he revealed that he did not trust the argument alone to do the work. And Einstein saw it. He saw exactly what was being asked of him. Not his opinion, but his name. Not his reasoning, but his verdict. He was being asked to be a stamp, not a thinker. And he refused. This is the pressure test, and it is the first mental model this story teaches. The pressure test is what happens when a powerful person in a room is asked not to think, but to ratify. Not to analyze, but to endorse. The system needs him to perform the role of ultimate authority, to confirm the hierarchy by lending his position to the outcome. And the measure of whether that person has genuine intellectual integrity is whether they recognize the test for what it is. Most people fail the pressure test because they were never taught it exists. They have been told their entire lives that when the senior person agrees with the critique, it is because the critique is correct, not because the dynamics of the room made agreement the path of least resistance. They have been taught that authority naturally flows toward truth. They were not taught that authority can be consciously used as a substitute for truth, and that the most powerful thing a credentialed person can do in that moment is refuse to play. Every time you have ever seen someone shut down your idea by citing what the experts think, by referencing what the senior people decided, by asking a higher authority to confirm the dismissal, you were watching the pressure test, and you were trained to accept the result as legitimate. But here is what nobody asks about this story. If Einstein had nodded, if he had turned to Feynman and said, "Yes, I agree with Pauli, this cannot be right," would that have made the theory wrong? The theory's eventual problems had nothing to do with Einstein's opinion of it. Science does not work by authority vote. Feynman understood this. What he saw that afternoon was proof, in real time, that even the most respected scientist alive understood it too. The second thing this moment reveals cuts even deeper. Einstein did not say the theory was fine. He did not defend it. He did not give Feynman the validation that every graduate student in that room would have desperately wanted from Albert Einstein. What he said was, "I have one concern: gravity. My concern is specific, it is mine, and it is the only concern I am prepared to put my name on. This is the precise objection, and it is the opposite of what schools taught you to do. Schools trained you to give general verdicts. This approach is wrong. This method does not work. This strategy will fail. General verdicts feel powerful because they sound complete, but they are actually lazy because they claim a certainty that the speaker does not have about territory they have not fully mapped." Einstein had spent the previous decade battling quantum mechanics itself, convinced at a philosophical level that it was incomplete. He disagreed with the probabilistic interpretation of physical reality that Bohr and others had championed. He spent years designing thought experiments to expose what he believed were its contradictions. He was, on some deep level, a man who had large, persistent concerns about the theoretical direction that physics was taking, and he still refused to use those concerns as ammunition against a 22-year-old's theory. Why? Because his concerns about quantum mechanics did not automatically extend to every new theory that touched those questions. Because having a general disagreement with a direction does not mean you can deploy that disagreement as a valid critique of every specific project. Because the honest intellectual position, the position Einstein held with uncommon discipline, is to say only what you can actually defend, and to hold your silence on everything else. I find only that it would be very difficult to make a corresponding theory for gravitational interaction. One sentence, one concern, one territory where Einstein had something real to say. Everything else, Pauli's full catalog of objections, the broader questions about the theory's viability, the room's growing consensus that this young student's work was probably not the final answer, all of it was left for other people to work out on other days. The uncomfortable truth is that the school system does the exact opposite of this. Schools reward confident general verdicts. They reward the student who can write the most comprehensive critique. They punish the student who says, "I'm not sure," and reward the one who says, "Here is why this is wrong," even when the comprehensive critique is half invention, built on borrowed authority, and the vague confidence of someone who has read enough to sound sure. Feynman absorbed something from Einstein's precision that afternoon that you can trace directly through the rest of his intellectual life. Decades later, in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech in 1965, Feynman described his work by carefully separating what the theory could do from what it could not. He named the limits. He did not oversell. He gave the precise objection in reverse, saying not, "I have concerns," but "Here is the specific territory where this works, and here is the boundary." The discipline is identical. It runs in both directions. But the third thing this afternoon reveals is the one that nobody talks about, and it is the one that matters most for your own life right now. Feynman walked out of that seminar having received no validation from Einstein. The theory had problems. Einstein himself named one. Pauli had named others. The greatest mathematician alive, John von Neumann, had been sitting in that room, saying nothing on Feynman's behalf. Henry Norris Russell, famous astronomer, had been in the room. None of them stood up to champion the work. By the logic of the authority validation system, the system you were raised inside, Feynman should have walked out of that room deflated. No endorsement from the top. Significant criticism from a giant, a theory with acknowledged weaknesses. The verdict of the room was, at best, inconclusive. Instead, Feynman walked out having seen something more valuable than a verdict. And years later, when he tried to put it into words, what he said was this: Einstein was a giant. His head was in the clouds, but his feet were on the ground. But those of us who are not that tall have to choose. That quote is usually treated as humble admiration. It is not. It is a precise description of a strategic choice. Feynman was saying Einstein could operate at both levels simultaneously, the abstract theoretical heights and the concrete experimental ground, because he was the rare kind of mind. Most people cannot do both at once. So if you have to choose, where do you plant your feet? Feynman chose the ground, the work, the specific problem in front of him, the equations on the board, not Einstein's approval of the equations, not Pauli's reluctant acceptance, not the consensus of the room, the equations themselves. And here is what that choice looks like in practice. This is the thing they never built into your education: confidence without verdict. The capacity to continue working on something because the work itself is real, independent of whether the authority figures in your vicinity have issued their blessing. Feynman did not need Einstein to tell him the theory was correct. He needed to understand, for himself, where the theory succeeded and where it failed. The seminar gave him one real piece of that understanding. Gravity is a problem. Good. That is specific. That is workable. That is something you can take back to the blackboard. What the system wanted him to take back to the blackboard was Einstein's verdict. What he actually took back was Einstein's method. Pauli was right, by the way. The Wheeler-Feynman absorber theory was never satisfactorily extended to quantum mechanics. Feynman himself acknowledged this. He spent years trying and could not solve it. But the failure did not invalidate the project. It redirected it. The thinking that Feynman did inside that framework, wrestling with those specific problems over the following years, fed directly into the path that led to quantum electrodynamics, the work that won him the Nobel Prize 25 years later. The approval of the room in Princeton, 1940, would not have changed that trajectory by a single degree. When you pull those three things together, the pressure test, the precise objection, and confidence without verdict, you end up with something that is the direct opposite of everything the educational system trained into you. The system taught you that expertise is a license to dismiss, that the most credentialed person in the room has the right to issue a general verdict on your work, and that the right response is to receive that verdict as truth. It taught you that authority flows naturally toward correctness, that the room's most powerful person is the room's most accurate person. It built a world in which Pauli's move is not only accepted, but respected. Challenge the idea, then reach for the biggest name to confirm the challenge, and watch the young person sit back down. Einstein did not do any of that. What he modeled in one quiet German-accented sentence, it was something the school system has never been able to teach, because it directly undermines the school system's own authority. Real intellectual courage is not defending your own ideas against attack. Any stubborn person can do that. Real intellectual courage is what Einstein demonstrated, the refusal to lend your name to a dismissal you have not earned, even when the entire room is waiting for you to do exactly that. Even when the easiest thing in the world, the socially frictionless, professionally costless, entirely expected thing, is to nod. The system failed you by teaching you that the goal was to earn that nod. From the right professor, from the right panel, from the right authority. The system failed you by making the nod feel like the point, as if the idea only becomes real when someone important confirms it. Yet Feynman never accepted that premise. What he saw that afternoon in Princeton was the most authoritative human being on Earth, demonstrating that authority is a choice, not a mechanism. Einstein chose to use his carefully. He chose to speak only from the territory he had actually mapped. He chose to give one specific concern rather than a general verdict. He chose, in other words, not to be the weapon Pauli needed. The vindication in this story is not Feynman's, it is yours. Because you were not wrong to feel frustrated every time you needed someone else's permission to trust your own thinking. You were not broken for resenting the system that made you wait for the grade before you believed in the answer. That frustration was the correct response to an incorrect setup. The system built the doubt into you on purpose. It needed you to doubt yourself and look upward for confirmation. Feynman looked at the equations. Einstein looked at the one thing he could actually speak to. And Pauli looked at Einstein. Because that is what the system produces when it runs without interference. Intelligent people who have learned to borrow authority rather than build their own. So, here is what Princeton 1940 actually teaches you. Not an inspirational story about two great men in the same room. A precise, usable framework. When someone tries to close down your thinking with borrowed authority, you are watching the pressure test. Name it, and it loses its power. When you have something to say only what you have actually earned the right to say. That is the precise objection, and it is far more powerful than a comprehensive verdict you cannot fully defend. And when the room gives you no endorsement, no champion, no official approval, keep working. The work does not need the room's permission to be real. That is confidence without verdict. Feynman proved it over the next 25 years. Einstein modeled it in one sentence. These three tools are yours now. They always were. The system just never told you. This was not the last time Feynman encountered this trap. Princeton, 1940, was the moment he saw it operate in real time. Close enough to study, under conditions extreme enough to be unmistakable. But the trap runs through every institution, every education system, every structure that puts credentials above thinking and consensus above curiosity. 11 years later, Feynman found himself in Brazil, 1951, and there he did not merely observe what the authority validation system does to a generation of learners. He walked into a room full of people who had built the system and told them, to their faces, exactly what they had created. That conversation is the thing they definitely do not want you to know about.